Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday, our Leading Change episode this week with Nilesh Makan. Hi, Nilesh. Welcome back.
Hi, Vasco. Thank you for having me back.
Absolutely. So, Nilesh, on Wednesdays, we want to focus on change because, of course, as Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, we are constantly working with change. And as you said in your own bio, you help businesses transform through transform people. It's all about change, right? It's kind of our day-to-day work, if you will. So we want you to focus on one of those stories, a story of change that you were involved with. And then what happened? Like, what were the steps that change process did go through, and then highlight for us, especially the tools, the tips, the tricks, the techniques you learned back then that you still apply today.
So change is a very interesting topic, and I think we often refer to change within a context of something called change management, right? And I always consider this term change management, and particularly the latter word, management, as something that is quite challenging to do, managing change. But if we take away the word management and we kind of think about it as a change evolution, for me, that makes a lot more sense because we're constantly changing, right? Change doesn't happen once off and then it's done. It's this constant evolution of change. And how do we deal with that? And for me, one of the stories, I suppose, was really working with the leadership team around agility and understanding how do they get themselves to change. And for me, I think that point is quite poignant, is how do we get leaders to change? Because I can't necessarily tell a leader to change. You know, they've often got a lot more experience, a lot more knowledge. They come from a place where they're quite prominent in the organization, in society.
And why would they change? I mean, they are leaders, right? So they're successful. Why would they change?
Why would they change? And for me, when I think about change, it comes back to a concept in the systems thinking around dialogue and the importance of dialogue. So if we want to effect change, what we have to do is start with understanding what dialogue means. How do we listen more intently? Understand where the frustrations and challenges are, and get people to speak about those challenges from different perspectives. And that's what dialogue is, right? Dialogue is really trying to understand things not from just a single perspective, but looking at multiple different perspectives, because we all have our own mental models, right? We all come from a place of difference. And I love that saying that we are the total sum of our thoughts. And when we say that we're the total sum of our thoughts, we all grew up very differently. I grew up differently to you. I grew up differently to my sister. Because we went to different schools, we had different experiences, and while there were similarities, we grew up differently. So in terms of these mental models, I think the first step of change is really trying to understand where people are at. And that requires that conversation and dialogue. It also requires a level of listening. And I've been trying to study up around listening and what that means. And there's this lovely book by Otto Scharmer called Theory U. And Otto talks about 4 different levels of listening. The first level is really downloading, where you listen for the sake of your own argument, right? Like, I'm listening and I understand it, and I'm just downloading information into my head by listening to whatever is said. The next level of listening is called factual listening. And factual listening is where we listen for slight changes, but based on fact that enhances our argument. So we want to learn a little bit more about where we are and where we're coming from. So we kind of learn a little bit of extra facts that help support our argument. The next level of listening, the third level of listening, is empathetic listening. And empathetic listening is then taking it away from yourself and starting to listen to something from a different person's perspective and trying to really listen to their arguments without judgment. So we have to suspend judgment when we want to listen with empathy. It's not about self, but it's about others. And we have to start moving towards more empathetic listening. And then the final level of listening, which they talk about in Theory U, is effectively generative listening. So how do we listen with an intent to create an emerging future? How do we listen with the ability to understand what is coming, and remove just empathetic listening and downloading listening, but have that true dialogue to understand and sense what the future holds, and then start building something that is more cohesive and incorporative and collaborative based on a multifaceted approach rather than a singular approach. When we kind of think about leadership change and changing in organizations, it's about having these dialogues and facilitating these conversations so that leaders want to change and start understanding that change rather than just saying you must change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to explore a little bit of what you just said. I think the listening part is super critical. I'll put the link on the show notes to the Theory U book, and definitely go and explore that. But I want to take it a little bit before the description of the different levels of listening that you made, which is that dialogue is about trying to understand things by looking at them from different perspectives. And I wanted to take that phrase and kind of turn it all the way up to 11 and say that in organizations, everything is a dialogue. And I want to here refer to, and I'll put the link in the show notes to the work by Ari-Pekka Skarp, a colleague that has been writing about this for a long time, and the work from, of course, Ralph Stacey and Esko Kilpi, philosophers and researchers that have been talking about the concept of organizations being in a constant state of conversation, right, of dialogue. And I wanted to take that phrase to 11 and say that everything we do is dialogue. Even dictating a vision, like we talked about yesterday, is dialogue. It's just not portrayed as collaborative and constructive dialogue, but it is dialogue, because there's no way that someone hearing a dictatorial leader will understand what the dictatorial leader says in exactly the same way that the dictatorial leader means it. Which means that the moment we react to something, even a dictate, we are immediately taking part on that process of dialogue, right? Continuous refinement of understanding through conversation and action. There's great work by Argyris also. I'll put the link on the show notes for his book. And if we take that phrase all the way to 11, dialogue is about understanding things by looking at them from different perspectives, and we now apply it to the role of the Scrum Master, we have to then push ourselves to work through that dialogue, right? And I think that from a change perspective and from a transformation perspective, this totally changes our way of acting, because it is no longer about getting someone to do what we want them to do. And by the way, there's many people out there that's exactly how they look at Agile, which is a countersense, but that's how they look at it. But it starts to be on a daily continuous conversation about shaping tomorrow together, right? Through that dialogue. And when it comes to change, that's the only thing that happens. There's nothing else that happens. Everything else is a theoretical utopian model. Everything we do is built together, even when we act by following a rule from a dictatorial leader, right? So I love the fact that you mentioned systems thinking and dialogue. And I also think that we need to, Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, we need to understand that we only work through dialogue and interaction with our peers.
Because you're right. And I think we forget that, when anyone talks about the Agile Manifesto, the first thing you start off with, besides the principles or anything, the first thing that we talk about is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And that refers to what you just said. Everything is about dialogue, right? It is about focusing on those individuals, understanding of those individuals, understanding those different perspectives and perceptions that people potentially have, understanding those biases and those cognitive biases, and helping shape using the knowledge that we've gained through things like behavioral economics and behavioral science to drive better organizations going forward, and understanding it from a perspective which is not destroying, but rather enhancing.
Yeah, and this then brings a new perspective to the whole idea of putting people first, because the moment we start putting people first, we understand that everything we do together, right? There's no plan that is being followed. There's only action. When we hear leaders say things like, let's not be theoretical, let's just execute the plan. Well, there's nothing more theoretical than thinking you can execute a plan. You can never execute a plan. A plan is a rough direction that people then transform into action, right? The only pragmatic thing that exists in the world is action. There's no plan that can be practical, right? And I think that sometimes we miss that. We misunderstand that the need for dialogue comes from exactly the fact that we want to be pragmatic, and the only way to be pragmatic is to act together, and therefore to have a dialogue, right? I say something, you react, we decide what to do, we act there, right? That's what's pragmatic. Writing a plan for the next 3 or 6 or 12 or even 24 months, that is an utopian theoretical model.
I love that. There is no plan, there is only action. Well said.
You just did my job. Thank you for that, Nilesh.
Thank you.
Leading change is one of the core skills we must acquire, but it is only one of the steps towards our success as Scrum Masters. Tomorrow, on Success Thursday, we will talk about how to define success for the Scrum Master role, we'll cover tips on how to measure your way to that position, and most importantly, how to develop that focus on continuous improvement that is as important for Scrum Masters as it is for teams. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.